Alrighty, so before we start into actually coding that rule one and testing it and determining how we test it, I'm going to have you create a new file. And it'll be in your week 12 folder, and we'll end up modifying it through the coming weeks. And it'll be called, and do use this exact syntax, style-guide.md, and I'll show you mine. So I created it in my week 12, all lowercase dash, and then I put a heading, CIT93 intro. You can pause here and just copy this if you want. But I do want this in the way you've created it, because in this case I've indented, so this is a heading 2 coding style guide. I've just put some random ones. We'll end up probably categorizing these, because in a real style guide, which is by the way very common in coding practices when you're working with teams, is to have a guide. So as an example, use code formatting to make your code readable, and you can either use the built-in, and I go over this, or you can use prettier, would be a recommendation. Number 2, always test code using built-in browser tools. I recommend DevTools in Chrome. And then from here on out, and this is one I mentioned last time, so I went ahead and formalized the style guide. That was the reason. All new functions. Now we'll end up changing this and refactoring other ones later, but all new functions will be written using the following standard: a named arrow function. And here's the example, and actually use this kind of backticks, so 3 backticks, and then JS, and then the actual code itself. And you can indent the code so that when you look at the output, now, I don't know if I've pushed this, but if you ever wanted to look at it, then it looks like it's aligned with the example. But I did a little, because when mine wasn't working, I'm like, why isn't that working? And that's what it is when you do code like this, you can still indent, but you have to have the backticks. So backticks JS, the example, and then 3 backticks. Okay, so have that as part of our code. Okay, so let's look at what we're going to do. So now you've done that. So now we actually have to implement that rule 1, okay? So what was that rule 1? Well, we wrote it in our code, so let's come back over here. So rule 1 here is that household members must be at least 1, okay? So how would we test for that condition? Well, we know we're passing in form data. So we'd say form data dot household, and in this case make sure you don't do household members error. Okay, so what do we want to test for? We want to know if it's less than 1. Okay, so if somebody has 0 in there, right, we would then have our validation be called. Now what would we do in that case is we'd say now that household members error dot text content. So we're going to set its text content equal, and in this case I can just use single quotes, household members must be at least 1. Okay, so that's the error message. Okay, so right now where we have some placeholder text, we should see that update. We then set is valid to false, which we'd already had done this as poor, right? And then once we get through, now we only have 1 check. Remember, we'll end up having multiples. Then we'll just return here. Okay. So let's actually see now in our code if this actually works the way. Oh, I forgot to start live server. I'd been back and forth with some other. There we go. Cool. I always do this. Now this placeholder text, and this is what I'm going to kind of help us remember, is that once we get one working, then we'll end up removing this default text. So let's just see though, right? So now let's say we put 0, which would be our, okay, we scroll down, but oh, we have a little bit of an issue. Issue in the sense that we do have something right now already validating our code, okay? And in this case, it is actually the HTML attribute. So let's go take a look. So if I go into my HTML, I like to open it to the side so I don't have to go back and forth, and I go look at my household, I see I have a minimum value of 1. Okay, so by hitting this, by inputting 0, and this is the key to understanding this, is that your built-in HTML attributes are your first line of defense, but it should not be your only line of defense. This is a valid, really critical issue because of the importance of form validation that I talked about last time, is that we really want to make sure that, we have multiple layers of protection. And of course, this is one, but in this case, we're like, okay, great, this works, but how do we test our validation? Okay, how do we then trigger this? Well, I guess the quick thing is we could, and don't do this, we could just eliminate this, but we really wouldn't want to do that, because let's say we did all this custom code, we had it all working, but then we actually disabled our first line of defense. Okay, so it's like, no, we wouldn't really want to do that. So how would we do it? It's actually kind of an easy way. And in this case, we use, it's basically, this is what's this is a chat about, the foundation, the HTML browser validation, that there is just a certain level of browser validation, right? And in this case, it's robust. Even if somebody had disabled JavaScript, it's still built in, but it's ultimately not what we want to give. We want to do both our custom and this as well. So here's what we can do. In our HTML, okay, in our form, so we'll come down to our actual form itself, okay, right here. And on the other side of form, we would just include non-validate. Okay, so basically what that is it eliminates the built-in values for now, and that way when we're through testing, we don't have to go through and then move, put back all these nice first level validations. We would just need to remember this. So if you ever see this on a form, you can know that, why it's there is for testing purposes, to do no validate. So let's see if in our code that actually now works. So if I put 0, will that actually work? Okay, so we know now, so at least now, and I already had a breakpoint set here, actually now we can walk through and see if, right? So we're going to say, okay, we're now inside the validate function. We're looking for, is it less, so is the form right? So now we've hit up against another issue. How did household members become 1 when we know we entered 0? Aha! So I want you to think for a minute. How did we know that? Or how did that happen? Well, we can know it here, but where in our code did this get set? Because we know right here, and in this point we've already run, we could step through our form handler, but let's just open it and see if we can see. And this is something like you've written code and you have to go back and remember, oh, why, so in this case, right here, right? Okay. So because that was 0, we could step through the code. It set it to, because it considered 0 false, it set it to 1. Okay, so we know right now, even before we do anything else, what's going to happen, right? Because 1 is actually a valid number for the logic. But let's go ahead and actually walk through it, because it's 1, right? So it's not going to hit our validation. It's going to return and then run, and everything is passed, and we're past the validation. Boom. Okay, so this is why this situation here. So now we can see we actually have already a level of validation that we've done, 2 levels. We've done 1 in the HTML, we've done 1 in our code. So how, now that we have it in place, how do we do this? Well, let's go back up here. So this is where it's fairly common to do something like this, do a -5, okay? Because then, and let's actually just go ahead, and this time, right, if we're here, we could watch what happens but in our form validation, but let's actually just leave it here and see, right, when it gets to this point. Okay, so now, and this will be, you'll see this use, you could actually use -1, but I was actually having a conversation with Jim and I about, for some reason, -5 is what typically developers use. Okay, so now we know that form validation, right? So now we're going to call it, pass it in. Well, it's already passing the full form. And so now our form validation is -5. Is it less than 1? Yeah. Okay, so now, and if we scroll back up here, now we should see our text content. Oh, yep, we now have our text content. We have not valid. Boom, right? Boom. So this is not valid, and now we're returning, so that when our logic hits here, what should happen is it should return and nothing else happens in our form. Okay? So let's do a couple things before I actually have you try the next one on your own. I'll give you the solution, but let's actually do this. Let's come back over here into our HTML. And for this first one, let's get rid of, because now we've tested it and we know it actually does work, right? So now we have nothing in here. Cool, because we'll talk about probably next time in 12.2 is how do we handle once we do update that. Okay, so let's run it again. Let's do -5. Now we don't have any pre-existing text. Let's come here, let's take off this just to watch it say, yep, okay. We know through here now, and the other thing we're going to end up doing is talking about, because this form is so long, how do we then make that a little easier for navigation from the user? But we know that through it, we know that it's there. Okay. All right, let's come back to what we need to do here. So in this case, we use the no validate to actually stop the built-in attributes. I didn't have you add a comment. I just put a comment in here. I had you start the style guide. You can, and I recommend doing some research about HTML input attributes versus form validation. And really, it's more of a, shouldn't be versus, could be just a layered approach, right? So what you'll do is go ahead and commit your code for form validation, coding, and testing, because we, as you see, we had to do several things in order to actually get the test done. Okay, so now what you're going to do here is you're going to attempt. Okay, now you're going to attempt the rule 2. Okay, so what I want you to do is attempt the code 2, and actually I think what I realize here is I'm going to actually give you you'll see a commit message here for my attempt. So what you do is you attempt the home square footage must be positive if it's not an apartment. So it's a house, right? So let's just go look at it real quick. So we know that on home size, we have an input of the square footage, but we also have the ability for them to just click an apartment, okay? And so in this case, we want to say if they clicked here, right? So let's go look at our rule again, right? If home square footage must be a positive if it's not an apartment, okay? So whatever, if they've clicked there, if they've actually giving it a square footage, then it has to be positive unless they've actually just said it's an apartment. So I'm going to have you attempt to write the logic. Now let's just say where that would be, right? So now here would be, and I'm not going to put it in there. Actually, I could. Not a bad idea. Okay? So in this case, here's our rule 2. Yeah, go ahead and do that part. Okay, so then, like I said, I realize I didn't do it now. I'll give you a commit message for yours, and then the next thing, right? So after this, I will give you the solution, and then you can modify. So I really want you to give this an attempt. This will be your basic what you have done for your checkpoint before. This will be your checkpoint for 2-1. This is the way I've said I'm modifying. We still will probably have traditional checkpoints later, we'll see. But in this case, after you finish this, you attempt it, you'll watch my solution. So what will happen here is on 12, instead of having your checkpoint will actually be the video where is my solution, right? Yeah, and then I'll actually have you, if you had to make, I'll figure out here, now that I'm going to do the next one, is how I'll handle this submitting the 2.1 form validation checkpoint. Okay, so I'll give you a commit message to do at the end of this one that says, hey, my attempt, and then if you needed to modify, and I'll give you an option if you didn't, if you got it right. So I'll do that, and you'll see that in the video I do next. Hope that makes sense.